In this video, we're going to cover the IBM Bluemix Platform as a Service application runtime environment and how it's supported by the CloudFoundry infrastructure. In this video, we're going to talk about components of the Diego architecture of CloudFoundry. This is available today in Bluemix Public. You'll learn about key components like the cell, the cloud controller, and the router. And we'll also show you the overall CloudFoundry architecture and key service layers focusing around the application lifecycle, application storage and third-party services, and messaging and logging. This slide shows the overall architecture layout of CloudFoundry. In subsequent slides, we'll go into each of the three key areas of this architecture, focusing on the components in each. The first layer we'll focus on is the routing, authentication, and application lifecycle layers. In the routing layer, there's a component called the router. The router handles incoming requests to CloudFoundry and directs these requests either to the cloud controller for managing the environment or directs the requests to application instances running on cells. The overall environment for CloudFoundry is supported with authentication services coming from an OAuth 2 server and a login server. This is how you log in to manage your CloudFoundry environment within Bluemix and how requests to the API endpoints in the cloud controller are authenticated. The cloud controller is a key player in the deployment of applications and supporting the application lifecycle. The cloud controller gathers your application data and components and sends that into the Diego system for building a copy of the application for running later through the process called staging. And it also then, once an application has been staged and has been built, directs the Diego system to identify a cell for execution and actually starts a task associated with running that application over a long period of time. Application availability is coordinated by the InSync, BBS, and the cell reps components. The InSync component stores the desired number of instances that you've specified, the number of long-range processes, into the BBS system. And the BBS also monitors input from the cell reps that are actually running instances to keep track of the number of instances that are actually active. And the BBS uses a convergence process to make sure that the desired number of applications instances and the actual number of application instances match. This next slide shows the components of CloudFoundry that are responsible for app storage and app execution. And it also shows a component that is responsible for binding services that are available in the service catalog to your application runtimes. The Diego cell runs individual application instances. The Diego cell uses something called a garden container for actually running each individual application instance. A garden container provides some containerization services that ensure your application is able to execute with the quota that you've been assigned and that it's protected from noisy neighbors within the environment. When an application is built in the staging process, the binary data for that is stored in something called a blob store and is copied out to each cell before the application instance is launched. CloudFoundry supports adding managed services to your application through the service broker component. Each service in the catalog has a service broker which responds to a request by provisioning a new service instance for your application and then returning environment variables that are bound to your application so that when your application runs, it can access the provisioned services. This slide shows the components involved in messaging and metrics and logging in CloudFoundry. CloudFoundry uses HTTP and HTTPS to communicate between components. It stores the frequently updated information that's used across the system in the Diego Bulletin Board Service, or BBS. And longer-lived control data is stored in the system called console. The NATS message bus was used widely in the DEA architecture, but is limited in Diego and primarily is involved in getting messages between the route emitter and the router for new application instances. The metrics and logging are provided by the metrics collector and the application log aggregator. The application log aggregator streams information out, and you can monitor that for your applications using either the CloudFoundry CLI or the Bluemix Web UI. And this concludes our summary of the components of CloudFoundry that support your Bluemix Platform as a Service runtimes.